Here we are, end of February. Well, I was thinking about sailing today. Sailing. Red sails in the sunset. May your sails be filled with happiness and joy and warm winds and lovely breezes. While sailing, I had trouble navigating the waters between Russia and Alaska. I couldn't get my bearings straight. It's fine to be enthusiastic about sailing, just don't go overboard, Hairman. Well, a dear friend of mine fell overboard while sailing on somebody else's boat. Well, I went to the funeral and found out that sadly he couldn't swim. He quickly drowned. Well, usually you don't give gifts at funerals, but I figured his family would want something to remember him by, so I gave them a life preserver because that's what he would have wanted. Now here's a nautical math problem. How long would you be sailing if you were sailing 220 yards at a speed of 1 nautical mile an hour? Not for long. Yeah, well, I was thinking about way back in the day. Late 70s, 80s, I guess it was. Should have checked my journals before I did this, but well, I was in Port Angeles, Washington. That was the year that the bridge was taken out. Wind up flying across Mount Rainier a lot of times, delivering pilots back and forth to the airport there in Forks, Washington, a logging town. But we won't go into all the corks and naily souls and drunken individuals there, or them betting boards where you call punch boards, where you punch out a winner, see how much you won. Yeah, I started out on a good size wooden boat with an elderly gentleman, and he taught me the ropes of salmon fishing. Trawling is what it really was. I wouldn't call it exactly fishing, because you're trawling with long line, and you're long lining and pulling in them salmon lickety-split. And I remember most of these boats that I worked on were jury-rigged and homemade affairs, and they had a license to do it, and it was like a 6-week period. You could make all your money and support yourself for a year, and I wanted in on that, that was for sure, because that's why I would go on these adventures, because up here in the hills of upstate New York back in them days, you didn't have 2 nickels to rub together, and there wasn't no money to be made, you know. I mean, you weren't going to make much on a dairy farm or cutting wood. So there I was, and the captain said, go down below and pull that lever and engage the pump on the air conditioner so that, well, it's an air conditioning motor there from an old car on an 8-cylinder Chevy, and it's to keep the ice in the hold from melting. You see, you'd pick up the ice at the ice house before you'd leave on the trip, and you'd be gone for 3-4 days a week. We'll get into that later, trying to get your sea legs back when you hit shore, because once you've been out there a long time, it's just you and the ocean. Man, that is glorious stuff. You and the fish and the dolphins and the sea lions in the ocean. Don't get better than that. And the next boat I worked on was an Alaskan Bay wooden double-ender, originally a sailboat. Now, they were double-endered because they could take the coming wind, and they could take the wind from the back and the waves from the back, and they could go either either way, in or out of the bay. Alaskan Bay double ender. That's why they were called a double ender, bay double ender. And my mind ain't working too good today. I'm trying to rub my brain cells together. It's a Tuesday. Most of these, and like I said, most of these boats were jury rigged. This one had a little 4-cylinder Volvo gas engine in it. Had a propane stove. And I remember the captains would say, "Hairman, what do you want? We're gonna put on some groceries before we leave. You want me to pick up some steaks?" And so, I mean, a lot of money in salmon fishing. The Japanese were paying real big dollars for sockeye and king salmon in those days, and they'd fly them out by plane, and money, and the money was floating in. Had a propane stove, so I went to light the oven one day and almost blew up the whole boat. See, propane, it settles down in the bilge, and I was lucky there wasn't any gas leakage that day, or we wouldn't have had me, the captain, or the boat. So we're out there, been out there for near on a week, and the drive shaft breaks. Well, the drive shaft actually didn't break. It was the bearing on the drive shaft that broke. And the captain didn't know what to do, and me being pretty handy with things, I said, "Well, you see that wonderful belt that's holding up your drawers? You give me that belt there and a knife and a wrench, and I'll make a bearing out of that." I cut a piece of that belt and wrapped it around that drive shaft and crammed it in between a couple wooden blocks and bolted it down and greased it up good, and we have the drive shaft working again. So I guess that saved me from almost blowing up the boat. And then we hit a school of fish like you wouldn't believe. We were pulling in sockeyes, king salmon, humpies, and everything you could possibly imagine, even a few sharks, quicker than you could lickety-split and say Davy Jones's locker, and there was no end to them. We just kept pulling them up on them hydraulic reels, and I'd be gutting them and throwing them down in the ice hole. Well, pretty soon, that boat was pretty overloaded. The hole was filled, the deck was slopped, and there was fish everywhere up to the gunnels, and the captain was looking at me and he's saying, "Well, what do we do? It's like going into a vault in a bank full of gold." And a couple bank robbers and one looking at the other and saying, "Well, the sacks are full, but should we fill our pockets or maybe get some paper bags or something, or canvas sacks?" We just kept pulling the fish in, and I was rearranging the ballast, and then a storm blew up. Real bad storm. But it was an Alaskan Bay double ender, so it could take it. We had to get our way back through the Straits of Juan de Fuca. I'll tell you a story about that later on in an airplane. It was a long trip back, and it was a big decision to stop pulling up that gold from the ocean. Man, we made a haul that time, and we were lucky. The engine held together and the boat held together, and we made it back. Rearranging ballast on a fishing trip. The fish were up to the gunnels. I remember I used to carry a fiddle with me back in those days, and when I stepped off the dock that day to get my land legs back, which is never easy after you've been out to sea for a week or so, because the land is so steady and the boat is always rocking, I fell overboard, fiddle and all. Fortunately, that fiddle was wrapped in plastic, so it saved it. Yeah, I'll tell you more about all these crazy stories later on. Maybe that thing about the plane in the Straits of Juan de Fuca. Fuca.